Hello, everyone. Thanks for everyone who's joining us today for this webinar. It's 8 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, but we'll give 2 more minutes for the audience to come online before we start. Okay, we're good to start now. Hello, everyone. I'm Juan Vial, a senior associate at RMI, working in the Global Gold Initiative team, and I will kick us off for today's event. We're delighted to have attendees and guest speakers from different parts of the world, including Indonesia, Colombia, Chile, and the US, among other countries today, for talking about this big topic, unlocking coal power purchase agreements, or coal PPAs, a key element in the transition from coal-based energy to clean alternatives. For today's webinar, we'll start with a quick introduction about the importance of coal PPAs and the role they play in the energy transition presented by RMI. Then we'll move on to hear about the Chilean successful case on building the right conditions that led to coal to clean PPA renegotiations there. This will be presented by Chairman Sterling, an advisor for various deals in the country. After this, we'll get into the panel discussion, where we have top quality guests bringing a variety of backgrounds and experiences from different geographies. We'll have with us 4 guests giving their views on the Indonesian Independent Power Producers Association, known as APLSI, the private financing institutions with Bank of America, the Chilean innovative transition deals with Chairman Sterling, and the Colombian power transformation with an advisor of the Ministry of Mines and Energy of this country. Then this panel will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A with our guest speakers. And finally, we'll have closing remarks with 5 minutes at the end provided by Powering Past Coal Alliance, our partner organization for this webinar. Just a reminder on the practical aspects of this webinar. We remind our audience that this will be recorded and available after the event. Also, feel free to submit any questions you have throughout the webinar into the Q&A box. We're disabling the hand-raising function for clarity, so chat will be the only way attendees can ask a question. Before moving us into the content portion of this webinar, I wanted to acknowledge the partners organizations hosting this event, RMI and PPCA, both organizations working in the field of energy systems, making efforts to reduce their emissions. And we both would like to thank Bloomberg Philanthropies here for funding the Unlocking Coal PPAs workstream done by RMI during the past year and for making this event possible. So to start and kick us off with this content section, we have a quick overview on coal PPAs and why they matter for the broader energy transition. We want to start here zooming out to show the motivation that took us to research around this topic first. This is mostly rooted in the fact that coal has been recognized as one of the highest emitting fuels, and the necessity of reducing carbon emissions has pushed nations to build momentum around these coal phase-out plans and increase the amount of commitments. just energy transition partnerships, known as GPs, and other initiatives have been building platforms on which these commitments can be translated into actions, usually by supporting capital mobilization. We can see that only with GPs, there's nowadays 45 billion of capital committed to support the Vietnamese, Indonesian, and South African transition. However, this transition is not that simple, and political, regulatory, economic, and other technical barriers tend to slow down the execution of these commitments. These aspects must be carefully considered when designing and implementing coal phase-out plans to ensure lights stay on, to incentivize growth and opportunities, to keep costs low for customers, and to maintain stability in our institutions. And of course, to achieve rapid emissions cut. But to achieve all these success elements in the coal to grid transition, we first need to get into these contracts called PPAs, as they set the key conditions on which coal power plants stand. So what can we say about these PPAs? First of all, we can just frame PPAs as a barrier. We have to acknowledge that PPAs as long-term contracts have certainly played a huge role in powering our grids and enabling the economic growth, especially for developing economies. And given the characteristics of these contracts, they provide the certainty required by lenders and developers to build a power project, as they generally ensure long-term stable revenues. Even more, they are currently playing a huge role in the climate change task we're facing nowadays by enabling increasing investments in clean renewable energy during the last decade. However, approaching PPAs is challenging. They are contracts, and a contract is a contract. The certainty they provide does not come for free. It usually implies having inflexibilities. We've noticed that a large portion of the global coal-fired power fleet relies on these contracts. India, Vietnam, and Thailand here are just a couple of examples of countries who are running these assets based on PPAs commitments for many more years. And this can certainly bring some challenges to energy transition, as they can first lock in cost, a special problem for those markets where renewables have already become cheaper than fossil fuels. Secondly, they lock in emissions, as PPAs keep these assets running to meet their supply commitments. This becomes very important, as addressing them from a climate perspective is urgent, as 2/3 of our 1.5 budget will be consumed by the global coal fleet if left unchecked. And finally, a third point regarding the technical challenges because of the operational constraints coal plants can impose to grid operators, and that are many times included in take-or-pay clauses or other PPA terms. But very important, and we want to emphasize on this one, even when coal PPAs must be addressed to help us achieve our climate ambitions, this must be done in a careful way to avoid undermining the integrity of these contracts, as they will still play a huge role to develop clean power projects and power our future. So as we've been realizing that this was a constant pattern occurring in multiple countries and for different grid realities, in RMI we decided to analyze pathways to transition these contracts. We tested 3 different scenarios here. The first one being simple retirement or early termination of the PPA with no replacement, where other available resources in the grid replace the services needed. Secondly, the replacement of the coal PPAs with a clean portfolio to ensure similar levels of energy supply. And a third scenario that we call repurposing of coal PPAs, which basically keeps the asset running, but at lower levels of utilization, especially for backup purposes instead of baseload purposes. Each one of these pathways answers to different grid realities, as keeping the lights on becomes a deal breaker condition. And among these scenarios, we tested financial instruments such as the use of concessional financing and other structures like energy transition mechanisms, known as CTMs, which bring equity contributions to the deal. We also tested policy reforms to levelize renewable competition against fossil fuels, which becomes relevant in nations where it's challenging for them. We did a couple of publications around this topic during the last month, which we'll be sharing through the chat for the audience, including a case study to transition a coal PPA in the Indonesian market. Finally, we've emphasized the vast presence of coal PPAs and the challenge they bring around the world, but the good news is that we're already collecting successful cases in many places. We can see here in the map 4 examples. Starting from the left, we have in New Jersey the Chambers and Logan coal plants retirements that marked the last coal power generation in that state. This took place a couple of years ago thanks to PPA renegotiation and also resulted in reduced bills for electricity consumers. The next one in Chile, framed in the carbon zero strategy, where many coal PPAs have been terminated and some of them renegotiated to extend their life, but replacing supply commitments with clean assets instead. And then we have a case in India where a bill was passed to allow termination of PPAs once the assets have reached 25 years of operation. This allowed the IPP Bihar to announce the retirement of more than 800 megawatts of capacity there. Finally, on the right, we have, in the context of the Indonesian JETP, the case of Chilean 1 coal plant, aiming to retire more than 600 megawatts 3 years earlier than the original schedule to fulfill national climate commitments. So now we'll dive deeper into one of these examples, the Chilean case. I'll pass the presentation over to Augusto Ruilova, partner of Sherman Sterling, who's joining us today. Augusto is a partner in the project development and finance practice of Sherman Sterling. He has over 15 years of experience working in the region and is a versatile practitioner advising on project development and non-recourse financing, as well as acquisition financing of energy, mining, and infrastructure projects in Peru, Mexico, Chile, and other countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. He regularly advises lenders, borrowers, and sponsors across a broad spectrum of financing vehicles, including public-private partnerships, revolving term loan, secured and unsecured credit facilities, and securitizations. Augusto, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you to the RMI team for the invitation. This is a topic which is very dear to the Sherman Sterling team. We have been working in Chile for many, many years, more than 40. And in the past 5, we have had a very active role in the transition to renewable energies and also in the transition from coal to renewable PPAs in Chile. So let's see what motivated Chile and which were the key steps taken. Next slide. So Chile's goals to terminate coal dependency. There are 3 3 main reasons for Chile to take the steps and implement the policies that were required to terminate coal dependency. Number 1 is to comply with its commitments under the Paris Agreement. Chile take these very seriously and started a number of discussions and engagement with the communities to determine how to better transition or how to better achieve the goals set in the Paris Agreement. However, this also came at a very interesting point in time in the Chilean market, because Chile was already starting to move to an expansion of the renewable power generating sources. And the reason is that there were a couple of big events, one in 2005 related to the Argentina stopping to supply natural gas to Chile. And then in 2010, around 2010, there was a big drought that evidenced the vulnerabilities of the Chilean system. So in order to mitigate these external factors, right, or said differently, increase its energy security, Chile decided to take certain steps in the direction of implementing other sources. Chile is not a significant producer of coal, so they had to import that, and we'll see how that had an effect on what's happening right now. They are not also a big. They actually do not have any gas, I think. So they import most of it. And while in the end of 2010s they started, they developed a huge project to import gas that also was costly and dependent from others. And third, as some of you may have heard, maybe more in my generation and more in the Latin American side, Santiago and other parts of the country suffered a lot from increased pollution due to the emissions. And thus, there were a lot of discussion as to, for example, closing or suspending schools in certain critical areas. So a third big motivation for Chile was to mitigate the social and economic adverse impacts of pollution. Next slide, please. So how do they get there? And this, of course, is not a simple question, and certainly, I'm highlighting some of the most important ones, or most important policies or measures taken. But I mean, the more one gets into this, the more you can identify that there is different pieces of this puzzle which all help. The law, the electricity law that it's in place, the principles that guide the system. But despite all of that, I think one of the is interesting because some of the Chilean policymakers and scholars that have studied this deeply do attribute the highest impact to the amendments to the PPA bidding process. This is very, very interesting because the amendments came into effect for the bidding process in 2014. And at that time, the number of bidders increased from literally 0 to 60. And then the next one, it was 80 bidders, and there was and they achieved very, very low prices. And how did they did this? So number one, they auctioned time blocks that were tailored to renewable power producers rather than auctioning 24-hour blocks, which of course solar cannot serve. They said, okay, we're going to divide these by blocks, and thus that increase the ability of the power producers or the developers to offer solar renewable power plants. Second, they provided longer terms. Rather than giving a 15-year PPA, they extend PPAs to 20 years. And a third very important measure that was undertaken was they provided longer deadlines to achieve commercial operations date, as before they were very short. Then they created what is called the PMGD, or Small Medium Generating Developers Law, which essentially stabilized the price and work as a PPA in essence, as the developers are sure to get a minimum price, which is determined based on the minimum cost of certain generators in the system. Then, as renewable projects tend to be, where the sun is, where the wind is, and traditionally the transmission lines have not been, in their paths. So one thing that also worked very well for Chile was that they exempted the payment of transmission fees, thus reducing the costs for these power, for the cost of generating the power in those places. Then there were other policies that increased the mandatory quotas for generating based in renewable or non-conventional energy. And there was an introduction of certain taxes to CO2 emissions, though these are perceived as not having as high as an effect, but essentially the reason is not because they do not deter the polluters from creating new power plants, but because the cost of that tax was not included in the total cost of the power producer, and thus did not reduce their competitiveness before other power producers. So this is kind of like, this all happened between 2010 and 2014, 2015. And then the Paris Agreement came. Chile decided that, okay, on top of these decisions to increase the power, the renewable offer in the system, they had to take specific measures to phase out coal. And thus, one of the virtues, of course, and weaknesses of the system was that the system was very concentrated. There were 4 big power producers that essentially dominated the market and had most of the coal power plants in the system. And thus, what the government did was they started to negotiate and enter into agreements, which not as a matter of law, but as a matter of they were voluntary. And these are big power producers. At least three of them are international, and thus they also have commitments globally. And their first arrangement in 2018 was, okay, we're not gonna develop any new coal-fired power plants. And please be aware, in the case of Chile, I think the most recent one of these power producers was a plant that was up and running as early or as 2012. So it's not that this is a really old fleet, but rather it's relatively new. And then in 2019 came the breakthrough, and in this agreement, the largest coal power generating companies decided to phase out their power plants. They agreed to retire 8 towards 2025, and the remaining towards 2024. Next slide, please. But of course, this is not without challenges, right? Like this was not a seamless transition, as you can expect. There were delays in the development of new projects, and the reasons for that were, well, number one, permitting. Certainly, that this is something in which every country needs to invest, in my opinion, more to give the right tools to the authorities to be able to assess the environmental risk and to help the companies get or not help, but like process those permits faster in order to allow the development of these projects. And second, and this is more related to the last couple of years with the pandemic, was procurement. There were a number of challenges to get the turbines and the solar panels to Chile during the COVID years. The second challenge is, again, Chile is a very long country, so the complicated parties, and not most, but a significant part of the solar array is in the north of the country. So bringing that power to the center where Santiago is, or even to the south, has always been a big challenge. And while the north serves a number of the important mines, which are the big power consumers, it's still this is still a big issue, and one of the reasons why the complete phase out of certain coal power plants will only be able to be achieved not as fast as they want in a couple of them, just because the transmission lines are not there to bring the power from the north to the center. And last one, the deployment of new technology. So this is a very interesting topic, which we can do a seminar on its own. But the batteries, in Chile and in every regulation, I think, require a number of improvements. So right now, there's not a total vacuum. Actually, there are some regulations, but there's still a number of uncertainty as to, for example, how you charge the battery, how you discharge the battery. If you have a preference, if you're treated as a renewal, if you are considered a generating company and therefore you receive some sort of capacity payment. So there is each new technology, green hydrogen, the same, has its own challenges, but not only regulatory, but also, commercially. Juan, next slide, please. So what is the state of affairs right now in Chile after these measures and what has been achieved? So let me start with the results of the decarb commitments, which are at the bottom of this slide. So the first one is 8 coal-fired power plants disconnected between 2019 and 2023. This is a huge achievement. Again, 2 years ahead of time, the government of Chile has managed to achieve these through policies and through these arrangements with these counterparts. Then the plan is to disconnect 7 more coal-fired plants by 2025 and 5 coal-fired power plants to be converted by 2025. So all in all, we have around 20 coal-fired power plants that represent a significant part. I think this is like 75% of the coal-fired plants in Chile by megawatts that will be disconnected by 2025. Again, improving the environment and creating all these other side effects that we are all aware of. And how was this achieved? So very interestingly, there has been a significant renegotiation of or early termination of coal PPAs, and again, while these companies have signed these voluntary agreements with the government, this was all done at the private level. You know, they used the tools of their own contracts. Well, most of these contracts were kind of oldish, 2012, 2010, even before that. There was a willingness on the side of the off-taker, right? Certainly, mostly mining companies, which also have international commitments to green their productions. They also had an interest in terminating these agreements, and in essence, what they did was they acknowledged that I mean, again, for you that are familiar with called PPAs, there is a component that is tied to the capital costs of the uh, capital costs incurred by the developer to build up the plant. There is a component that is related to coal, and then there is a profit, the coal being the cost of producing. So essentially, they reshifted these contracts in able to, you know, acknowledge that there was this fixed part, this fixed capacity payment that needs to still be paid, whether it's called that or not in the contract, and then change the source of the variable portion of that price from coal to something else, which was related to their ability of the company's ability to deliver clean energy. There was, and just to say this, I mean, it is very challenging because, or it was a very challenging process by this for all of these companies, as they had to renegotiate these agreements. I wouldn't say entirely, but it was not just changing, hey, it's called for renewals. There were a number of terms that were brought up to date and that require significant work on the parts of the constituents. And you know, some of these took a couple of years, some of these took shorter. But as you can see, and these contracts, I think the framework that RMI has described in the paper is very interesting because it coincides with a number of the things that actually happen in the different of these cases. You know, how practice match theory. So yeah, this is the Chilean experience, a successful case for sure. Juan?
Thank you, Augusto, for sharing the insights on Chile. We definitely hope, and especially me as a Chilean, that the rest of the decommissioning schedule moves forward in a successful way. So now we'll move into the panel section. My colleague Tyler will take it from here to introduce and moderate the panel. Over to you, Tyler.
Thank you so much, Juan, and thanks to Augusto for the super interesting case. It's really exciting to see that solutions are being implemented to support the PPA transition in the real world. So as Juan said, I'm Tyler Matsu. I'm a manager with RMI, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel, which brings together a pretty diverse array of perspectives, both geographically and across the ecosystem. So from independent power producers to financiers to legal experts and policymakers as well. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Pak Arthur Simatupang. For more than 15 years, Arthur has been supporting the expansion of the Toba Bara Group, an independent power producer based in Indonesia dedicated to innovating in the power sector with a variety of technologies and nowadays promoting clean expansion. He currently plays a key role as the President Commissioner of PT Toba Bara Energy. In this position, he was also elected as chairman of the Association of Indonesian Private Electricity Manufacturers, or APLSI, to advocate and champion the interests of independent power producers in Indonesia's electrification program. Thank you so much, Arthur, for joining us, especially during your evening in Indonesia. When you have a moment, please go ahead and turn on your video. Our second panelist is Alan Levy. Alan Levy has been with Bank of America for 26 years and has over 30 years of experience in financial services. He is currently a managing director at Bank of America and is the head of strategy and advisory for the Global Sustainable Finance Group. He has also held senior positions within finance and operations across the Bank of America's FICC businesses. Alan is a CPA and prior to Bank of America worked at KPMG as a senior auditor for their financial services practice. Really great to have you, Alan. Our third panelist, whom Juan has already introduced, is Augusto Ruiloba from Sherman and Sterling. Thanks again, Augusto, for being here and for already sharing the Chilean case. We're looking forward to discussing further. And then last but not least, we have Felipe Alberto Corral. Felipe Corral is advisor to the Minister of Energy and Mines of Colombia and part of its Just Energy Transition Unit. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Political Economy from the University of Heidelberg, a master's degree in Public Policy from the Hertie School, and is currently a doctoral candidate at TU Berlin. Felipe has been working within Colombia's Ministry of Energy in the advancement of policies to accelerate the transition in coal-fired power generation assets in the country, while including key aspects such as worker retraining, economic diversification in affected coal mining regions, and public participation. Welcome, Felipe. Thank you also for joining us today. We're going to kick off here with a bit of a panel discussion, but as a reminder, if you have any questions at all for our panelists, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, because we'll have a bit of time at the end for additional questions before we wrap up. Great. So I think let's get started maybe with a question for Pak Arthur. So Pak Arthur, I know that you both represent an IPP in Indonesia and also represent APLSI, which represents the broader interests of IPPs in Indonesia. We'd love to hear a little bit more about where IPPs are at in terms of their interest and engagement on coal transition solutions in Indonesia and what is driving that interest.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Good day to everyone. So my name is Arthur Simatupang, as introduced. I chair the Association of IPP in Indonesia. In terms of numbers, I think we have built and constructed and have developed roughly about 25% of the national installed capacity in Indonesia. So about 18 to 19 gigawatts, which is built mostly from IPP. The structure mostly is an PPA for about 25 years tenor. We sell to the grid through a single buyer because Indonesia follows a single buyer market, which is PLN, which is the Indonesian state-owned enterprise. And so it still adopts the decentralized power distribution. And I think the members of IPP at PLSI have been busy basically, you know, we started from about the 10,000 megawatts that was open to the private sector since the administration with the previous president before President Joko Widodo, and then followed by the current administration by President Joko Widodo also launching the 35,000 megawatts, in which also the IPP is allowed to participate on the development and the construction of IPP power plant, but not in terms of transmission and distribution, which is still under PLN. So I think the last, I would say 15, 20 years represent most of where the IPPs are at. So in terms of the age of the plants, they are relatively young as to compare to some of some of the coal transition is decarbonized that is being conducted in US and Europe. They're mostly in terms of the plant age themselves are usually about 40 to 50 years. So we're relatively young, especially the ones that are made by IPPs, because we kind of came along a bit later. Before it was all built by PLN, which is the state-owned enterprise, and its subsidiary, which is PJB, which is now being converted to Nusantara Power, and the other one called Indonesia Power. So where we are now at the moment, I think, as you know by now, we have two platforms at the moment for the coal transition. Most of our sponsors are keen to participate. Some might have, give a different color, but most of them are also publicly listed companies. So, we become the last 5 years become ESG compliant, and it's also what do you call it? Compulsory now to do sustainability report, mostly for the listed companies. So In terms of expansion, most of the sponsors do not, also with the coal-fired power plant moratorium, there is no further expansion of coal-fired power plant in the pipeline, except the ones that are already signed in terms of PPA with PLN previously before the regulation came out. So I think in terms of wanting to develop and diversify the portfolio more and more into renewable and green projects, I think that, there's a big appetite to do that. But obviously, I think also we need to look at in terms of, so Indonesia is quite interesting. It's an archipelago. So it consists of thousands of islands. So they're not connected like a single land-based continental country such as China or the US or Australia. So the system that are only connected at the moment is just the Java-Bali system. And all the other islands, the major islands such as Sumatra and Kalimantan, Sulawesi, have their own system in which, there is a plan to build a subsea cable to interconnect all the main islands. But at the moment they are separated. So that's a challenge in itself. And I think in terms of investment for renewable will require a significant investment in the transmission and distribution as well. And us as a private sector, we're willing to participate in that as long as the regulation allows us to do so, or become an EPC to PLN, which is the state-owned enterprise, because I think that will also become a key enabler to the transition story in Indonesia. In terms of the early retirement, we've seen two platforms. One is the one that obviously is now a country platform initiated by ADB, and now with the Indonesian sovereign INA is also working together with that. And the first one you mentioned is the Cirebon Power, which is a member of us as well, which is basically the one that we're trying to emulate. Once the successful model is built, I think we would try to copy paste that towards other potential power plants, that have sponsors that are willing to exercise in terms of restructuring a some sort of blended financing for the early transition. Another one that we need to also make sure that we are aligned is PLN, because obviously they report to three different ministries. One is the Energy Ministry, and that is the in terms of the annual grant plan going forward, it's all aligned. What PLN is doing is all built on a national energy plan, and in which they provide an annual electricity plan, in which the energy mix is there. This is the first time it's called the RUPTL, in which more than 50% is actually coming for project further down the line coming from non-fossil. So that's a good indicator of the projects coming forward. The other hurdle, I think, with PLN, I think we are not allowed to build a power based on feed-in tariff, so it needs to be built to have to compete with the current existing cost to produce or generate electricity in the system, which is mostly still majority dominated by fossil, coal-fired, diesel, gas. So like for instance, in the Java system, in order for you to participate and submit your tender, it needs to not be more than 7 cents per kilowatt hour. Base load, a minimum 85% availability factor. So that's a challenge in itself, because if you look at the intermittent supply from renewables such as solar and wind, which is will require some battery energy storage system. I think the LCOE will definitely become double digit, which it's hard to compete.
Definitely.
Unless you can sell it as a follower or as a peaker or a hybrid solution, which doesn't automatically eliminate all the coal fossil power plant in the system, which can possibly be a solution. Other than that, so I mentioned about pricing and also regulation. I think, other than that, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is a $20 billion commitment by the IPG, International Partners Group, including the G7 countries, and GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, have committed the $20 billion package. Can be consisted of a mix of equity, grant, or concessional loan.
Yeah. I think
That is also there on top of the country platform that I mentioned earlier with ADB and the INA. So I think they're about to roll out the comprehensive investment and policy package. The CIPP that is about to be rolled out just in time before the COP28 in Dubai. So I think that's exciting as well, because then we will see what's included and what types of stuff that we can explore to decarbonize the electricity sector. I think I'll stop right there first, Tyler, and then we can go into the Q&A later. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Pak Arthur, for that response. And I think that's actually a great segue to a question for Alan at Bank of America, who I know has also been involved in GFANZ's Mobilizing Capital Working Group. Alan, I'd be curious, what some of the solutions or innovative solutions you are currently exploring, either within Bank of America or with GFANZ, especially for privately owned coal plants to support their transition.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. As Tyler said, I'm Managing Director and I'm Head of Strategy and Advisory for the Global Sustainable Finance Group at Bank of America. And I am actually on the GFANZ JET-P working groups with a number of other banks. I think Arthur brought up a bunch of really, really good points in Indonesia. At one point, which I'll touch on really briefly, is the age of the coal-fired power plant fleets, especially for the independent power producers. It's very, very young relative to what you see in the United States and Europe, which makes it a lot more difficult when you're thinking about transitioning, right? The IPPs put capital in. They've got long-dated PPAs, which are great for being bankable purposes, but make it much more difficult to transition them out early, because there's, how do you price that to take the equity out and the debt out and make the economics work? I think one of the things we have been talking about and exploring, aside from just general renewable builds and things like that, which I think Arthur also brought up a very, very good point, the intermittent nature of that, you still need baseload, right? I think the Indonesian government has been very, very clear, and rightfully so, that they expect their power source for their people to be 24/7. They want to know when they get up in the morning and flip the light switch on that the lights go on. So they need baseload. They don't want to have intermittent power. Coal-fired power plants, as a general matter, are not really great to be peakers, just because of the nature of keeping the fireball hot. So one of the ideas we have been thinking about, is there's decommissioning coal-fired power plants early, but there's also, can we transition and retrofit them and work with the IPPs to retrofit them so that they can co-fire lower carbon fuels along with the coal and reduce the carbon intensity and the carbon emissions today? You think about other programs where there's co-firing either with natural gas or biomass or other things, which really significantly reduces the carbon emissions and the carbon intensity. That's a way to sort of transition, and as the coal-fired power plant fleets then age, then you can start having a better conversation around, okay, how do you retire them early and take them out before those PPAs end? One thing I'll just mention, and I think Arthur again touched on it rightfully. If you look at the United States, the average age of the coal-fired power plant fleet that we still have is probably approaching 50 years. When people talk about a useful life for coal-fired power plants, they can pretty much run forever. Technology is pretty easy. Replacing the boilers and stuff is not that costly. So really trying to find ways to take them out, decommission them before they, early is going to be critical. The PPAs are a critical component of this, right? What made them very, very bankable so that the IPPs could get financing on them is the same thing that makes it difficult to come up with termination strategies for them. So I think the key is really trying to figure out how to bridge the economics and transition these plants, until you can one, take them out early, but also have renewables along with battery storage and other technologies that can provide 24-hour power, so that these communities have that, and that they continue to expand their production and uplift their people, and bring that stability to the country.
Thanks so much, Alan. Super, super interesting to hear your perspective as well. So we've heard a little bit, I think, about some of the opportunities and some of the exploration that's happening in Indonesia. Augusto, obviously the PPA transition in Chile is already underway, and this also relates to one of the questions that we got in the chat. But I'd be curious to understand, from your experience in the Chilean context, what were the kind of main elements that really kind of incentivize stakeholders to move from this place of exploring solutions and wanting to realize opportunity to be able to move toward actual PPA renegotiation or PPA termination?
Sure. I think that, again, the Chilean case has some very good things going for them. I think number one is that these IPPs, like NG in particular, which was part of the question that someone asked, or NL, which is the other, or AES, they all have global commitments towards net zero, right? So they already had, and while this needs to be matched with a economical sense, they were already incentivized to transition. Then, in the case of these three producers, they typically build the plan to serve. While they were not, direct PPAs, but virtual PPAs, they did build the plan specifically to serve a particular client. So there was an understanding that the capex that was invested, was reflected in the price under the PPA, and thus the transition. The transition included that capex portion, or the transition to a clean energy PPA does not reflect a pure renewables PPA cost, if you want, but rather, the price is a mix of whatever was the capex under the existing coal power plant, plus a new variable component, which in the case of the coal-fired PPA was coal, but in the new one, you tie it to something else. So I would say, the IPP was interested in the transition. Second one, that the client was typically also very interested in the transition. They also have some commitments, and as you know, there's some regulations coming up in Europe that would, impose a tax or a duty on importing materials from other countries, and this tax will be, or this duty will be, size based on their carbon intensity. So for some of the Chilean mining companies, it was key to start this transition earlier. And we see this also in Peru, for example. A number of the mining companies are now auctioning or bidding out renewable PPAs, so to have a smaller carbon footprint. And third, again, it's not evident, but of course, the political pressure of the government played a key role. And while these agreements are all voluntary, there were some changes, and there are some changes in the law that will start kicking or having certain effects later that would make the businesses of these companies less and less profitable.
Thanks so much, Augusto. And I think that's a good kind of transition. You know, we've heard about some of the enablers in Chile. We've heard from Paco, Arthur, and Alan about some of the potential ways that policy could help support and incentivize this transition. Felipe, I know that you work closely with the Ministry of Energy, and I'd be curious to understand, you know, is this process of supporting PPAs and IPPs to transition, is this something that the Colombian government would like to take a lead on? And if so, can you talk us through what that process would look like from a policymaker perspective in terms of how you're thinking about incentivizing this transition?
Sure. So thank you everyone for this very interesting panel. I think for a country that is increasing its ambition in terms of the transition as is Colombia, it's very interesting to hear the experiences in other geographies. So to give you a very quick context, Colombia is a kind of particular case in comparison to the others mentioned today, because first, most of the capacity, power generation capacity is hydro-based. So we have a relatively clean electricity matrix in which only 8% of the installed capacity is coal-fired. So the rest is mainly hydro and gas. And we are seeing a great expansion of variable renewables in our power market. A second difference that is important to mention is that while we do have power purchase agreements, both for renewables and fossil-fired capacity, the ones in fossil-fired capacity are not so long-term as in the other cases mentioned today. So we're seeing that there are long-term contracts, but they stretch sometimes between 2 and 6 years. So not as long as the 25 years that Arthur was mentioning, for example. And we have a very particular role for both coal and gas fired capacities, and that is to work as a backup for times such as this, where hydrology is not as good as it is normal. So what difference does that produce? The long-term commitments by coal-fired power plants result not from power purchase agreements, but from capacity mechanisms that commit these capacities as a firm alternative to variable hydrologies. What we're seeing now is that most of the plants that are granted these long-term commitments to offer firm power, not necessary power purchase agreements, no, is that most power plants that have been assigned this longer term are the new ones and the cleaner ones, but that is not the majority of the capacity. The majority of the capacity is comprised of coal-fired capacity, is comprised of older power plants that are only granted 1-year extensions of these firm commitments, and that work on a kind of shorter term. So they're not such locked in as the newer power plants in the system. And this is kind of where we're focusing right now in terms of the policy to accelerate the transition from coal to clean. Because in these older, more inefficient assets that are already reaching the end of their economic lives, we see that there is a great necessity to engage in what we call a preventive transition based in a series of strategic investments in first expanding the capacity of generation with clean alternatives, mostly renewables. Second, that we also deploy technologies of both storage and ancillary services such as synchronous condensers and STATCOM and that kind of technologies where it is needed, because again, we do not run the coal-fired power plants as a bailout, baseload, but rather as a backup and sometimes peaker alternative in the different nodes of the electricity system. But mainly, besides this technological dimension, we are focusing on what we see as the central challenge in this transition, and that is the reskilling and reconversion of the workforce attached to these power plants, and especially in difference to at least the experience in Chile, the miners, because we have a domestic mining industry that is attached to these power plants, even if the volumes of coal extraction are relatively reduced. And we are betting for a very important strengthening of the relationship between the government, the enterprises, and the territory. In terms of the kind of revising these longer-term commitments that allow the earlier retirement of coal assets, what we're looking is we're identifying different levers that different policy think tanks such as Polo en Transiciones Justas and others have delivered to us that suggest that we can design auction mechanisms to redistribute these longer-term commitments between other producers in the grid that are not getting them, especially renewable energy producers. And we're trying to integrate that into the longer-term grid expansion plans that we have in the country.
Thanks so much, Felipe. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the aspect on the transition for the mining sector. I know that we've focused a lot of this discussion on the opportunities for IPPs, but of course need to think about the upstream sector. It's quite relevant both in Colombia as well as Indonesia. So I might just do one last flash round for our panelists. And if you could just keep your answer to maybe one line, and maybe I'll go in reverse order this time, starting with Felipe. So the question I have for you, Felipe, is what is one thing you think needs to happen to accelerate and scale the transition of coal PPAs?
One thing, yeah, I think we would have to adjust the regulations and the working of the electricity market so that, as in the Chilean case, it is friendlier to the renewable energy integration.
Great, thanks so much. Augusto, what is your answer to that question?
I think I'll take it from the thing that worked in Chile, which is, the correct auction terms for the PPAs as well. Like a PPA that reflects or that caters to the renewable energies offer.
Thanks, Augusto. Alan, what is one thing you think needs to happen to accelerate and scale the transition of coal PPAs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the incentive structure in some countries is geared towards supporting, that industry, which is understandable, and putting in an incentive structure that supports renewable power would do a great job of that transition. And just quickly, if you look at the United States and the Inflation Reduction Act and what that's going to do for that industry, I think it makes sense.
Thanks, Alan. So again, kind of the enabling environment for this transition. And last but not least, Pak Arthur, one thing you think needs to happen. You're on mute. Let's see.
Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, again, Indonesia is an archipelago, so I think huge investment in the grid, also incorporating renewable will be key. Also, I think the ability to have some type of financing through the carbon market can also become an enabler on top of the ETM that we're already seeing to incentivize people to decarbonize. One more thing I think is like I said, I think I agree with everyone here with the auction mechanism. I think we need to see more and more project pipeline going forward, and have some type of a bundling mechanism between the sponsors that are willing to do early retirement and getting a project in renewable sort of becoming a one package.
Well, I want to say thank you again to all of our panelists here. I thought the closing responses were quite indicative of some of the broader kind of ecosystem challenges that need to be addressed to support this transition. I might pass over to Julia from the Powering Past Coal Alliance, whom I've left very little time to wrap up our session today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tyler. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia Skorupska. I'm the head of the Powering Past Coal Alliance Secretariat. The Powering Past Coal Alliance was founded in 2017 by the UK and Canada, and it's the world's leading multi-sector, multi-stakeholder alliance trying to accelerate the transition from coal to clean. And one of the key things we do is we try to bring together our members. So we currently have a quarter of the world's governments, financial institutions managing $17 trillion. We have subnational governments and coal-dependent regions, and we have leading utilities as well. So this is a great reservoir of experience that we draw on to try and support others to deliver the coal to clean transition. So through webinars like these, through bespoke workshops, and through policy briefing. And I'd like to thank all of the speakers today for their really insightful contributions. It was really great to hear the different ways in which people are approaching this problem of transitioning PPAs. And to conclude, I think the thing to emphasize is the reason why we're all here is that coal use must fall rapidly and substantially over the next 10 years. We know that that's necessary to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. But as we also heard from Augusto today, it's necessary to protect the health of our citizens, to protect our energy security, and also to ensure that our citizens and our businesses are able to access the benefits of the fast decrease of energy prices as a result of renewable energy. But also, as we heard today, a number of coal power purchase agreements run beyond the timelines what we would like to see coal phased out. So that's 2030 in advanced economies and 2040 in the rest of the world, according to the IEA. And so it's really important for us to come together and work out ways in which we can transition these power purchase agreements. And we've heard today some really practical examples of how that can be done. So the key message seems to be that we need to get the right stakeholders to the table. You need to have governments, you need to have utilities, you need to have IPPs and private finance involved, and that there is a way in which we can find to help transition these PPAs. So, I suppose to conclude, obviously to thank our panelists, it was great to hear their experience and to encourage others to kind of take this road as well. So RMI and PPCA are both committed to supporting people to address some of the challenges of transitioning PPAs. As I said, the Powering Past Coal Alliance has run a number of kind of bespoke workshops and consultations with governments looking at how to do that. If you'd be interested in that, then definitely get in touch with us. The other thing that the Powering Past Coal Alliance is doing is we're starting a process of thinking about what are the enabling factors. So that was something that our panelists brought out, but we need also to be thinking about the enabling factors around the energy market and also around kind of what financial institutions are doing, what government policies are. If you look on our website, you can see that some of the work that we've done already on this, it's a work stream that we will be carrying on. So do let us know kind of what your thoughts are about what are the key enabling factors, what is it that governments need to be doing, what is it that international financial institutions need to be doing, what is it that utilities should be doing. And also tell us if you'd like to be part of this dialogue. So we'll be regularly updating our website with opportunities to join in this dialogue. Because as we've heard today, it's one of the really key things we need to do in order to phase out coal in time to prevent some of the worst impacts of climate change. So thanks once again to RMI for hosting this workshop together with us and to all of our panelists. I definitely leave with lots of really practical things to think about. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Julia, for the great wrap-up after this journey around the challenging topic of PPAs. So we're a bit over the time, and we reached the end of this webinar. We want to thank, again, the participation of all the attendees for joining us during this hour, our panelists for contributing, the speakers, and all the people involved that made this event possible. Our contact information is displayed on the screen for any further questions. Happy to keep in touch for any conversations around this topic. Thank you very much and have a good week, everyone. Goodbye.